Hello and welcome to October's, I think I've got that right for a change, October's All the Everything. Welcome, welcome. I am overjoyed and very excited and full of deep appreciation to be speaking about the wounded healer today. This is I'm going to use the word archetype for a moment, but I'm going to say more about even that word archetype in a moment. This is an archetype that one way or another has been incredibly present for me, for both myself and Jonathan, for many years, in that the crux of the work that we do in really all Waking the Wild crucibles, even if it's not spoken about directly, the crux of all the work we do is ultimately that the medicine, the gift, is in the wound. And of course, in our crucible, medicine is very much focused on that, but really it's a kind of, it's a backdrop to other work we do, even if that isn't the obvious focus of the work. It's kind of woven in, because it's, without having that understanding of ourselves, of our soul, it really keeps life at this kind of much more surface level. And as soon as we start to recognize ourselves in this like much deeper manner as souls who came here to have a particular kind of life, a particular kind of destiny, wounds and all, and start to relate to our wounds differently, that really is the crucible for everything. So again, this is an archetype and a context and a way of thinking and a way of being that's been present for us and woven into the work we do for many years. And this year, slowly, without me really knowing what was happening, this archetype of the wounded healer and the myth of Chiron began speaking to me in a new way. And I've, over the years, kind of like accepted, and this was hard in itself. I'm about to use a word that I really struggled to use for many years. I've accepted over the years that one of my gifts, part of my own medicine, is being a channel for archetypes that sometimes are for me personally, and sometimes they're for the people we're working with in a particular crucible. And that again was a challenge for me to be with initially, this sense of being this channel for the archetypes. And the interesting thing is, even though I've just said to you that for many years we've worked with this notion of the medicines in the wounded healer as an archetype in its own right hadn't spoken to me in quite this way before. My sense is I just wasn't ready for it. I needed the embodied power and the backdrop and the understanding of the different archetypes and how they call people into healing, into power. I needed that first, is my sense, but who knows? So over the course of this year, the wounded healer has been slowly speaking to me, calling me into different strands of understanding different aspects of it. It's been speaking to me via the stars astrologically. It's been speaking to me in the form directly of the centaur, which, as I'll talk about in a moment, is Chiron, is the myth. He was a centaur. It's been speaking to me very clearly in terms of like, this is ultimately the archetype that we have to make conscious to do the work we're doing. Very clearly, again, like directly coming through me in an embodied way that honestly I don't think I was ready to be present to, because of what that brings. This notion of the wounded healer suggests it isn't the healed healer, and I wasn't ready to fully look that in the eye yet. So this again isn't a conversation I was ready for until now. And now we are. I want to say first and foremost, welcome to the spirit of the wounded healer within and without. And I'm saying spirit right now because from a shamanic context, that's what we're talking about. Although I've used the word archetype, and it is an archetype, we're also talking about this spirit that is here gracing us with its wisdom, with its power, allowing us to see what's possible, see the blueprint, see the pattern and how it relates to us in our lives. And so we could call the wounded healer a constellation. We could call it very specifically a planet stroke planetoid. We could call it a myth. We could call it an archetype. We could call it a spirit. We could call it an energy. And whatever way that makes sense to you, and that might change as you're listening, allow that to be as it is. There is no need to kind of think, I don't know, for example, say the notion of an archetype really speaks to you, but looking at it astrologically doesn't. There'll be parts of this show that perhaps aren't for you or aren't for you now, and that's okay too. Allow it to be what it is for you. But regardless how you relate to it, let's look at who the wounded healer is. Who is this wounded healer? So first, let's look at it through the lens of the Greek myth of Chiron. Chiron was a centaur. The difference with Chiron was that whilst the other centaurs, as far as his myth was concerned, were wild and even savage, had a quite kind of known for violence, known for lust. Chiron was different. He was wise. He was a healer. He was an astrologer. He was a teacher of many of the well-known figures of that time that appear in other myths, including Hercules, which becomes important in a moment. So he was also immortal, which also becomes very important in a moment. So he was this really well-known figure of the time before even the story I'm about to tell you happened. Now, because he was this healer, because he was this person who was very wise about how to use the herbs, the poisons, the different spirits of that world, he used them in all sorts of ways. And there'll be so many different variations of this myth. I'm going to just choose one today to tell you. So as a version of the myth goes, he made a particular poison, and it's interesting to notice he made the poison, and it was of the creature, the monster Hydra. And this poison ended up on an arrow that Hercules was going to use. And so it was Chiron that got the poison, created the concoction to use in the arrow, and it was Hercules that had the bow and arrow. In a complete accident, a complete twist of fate. This wasn't something that had like an obvious cause and effect. This was an act of fate. Accidentally, and depending on the version of the myth, this arrow pierced Chiron in the leg. And because of the potency of this poison, the wound was horrendous. And for all of Chiron's wisdom, for all of his experience and knowledge, he could not cure this wound. So fast forward, however many years, depending on the story version we're telling, he got to the point where he was desperate. And yet there was nothing he could do. He couldn't cure it. And also he couldn't die because he was immortal. He went to Zeus, the king of the gods. And again, depending on the version, he either asked for help to become mortal and therefore he could die, or swap places with Prometheus, who had stolen fire from the gods to give to humanity and had been thrown to the rocks to have his liver pecked out daily for the rest of his life, because he was also, well, the rest of his life, the rest of eternity, because he was also immortal. So another version is he actually said he'd swap places and said, I may as well be there for eternity because here I am anyway, but let's set Prometheus free. And so at some point, there was this submission, this sacrifice, this giving over himself to the divine. So I'm going to pause there with that myth. And I'm now going to talk about this from an astrological perspective. So Chiron was, and depending on different viewpoints, could be described as a very small planet, a planetoid or a comet. And it was only discovered in the 1970s. And if you know me in numbers, I'm going to say 1977. I could be wrong. And Chiron was only discovered then. And the interesting thing is, it has this like very odd movement. It doesn't have the usual kind of like circular movement like many of these bodies do. It moves between Saturn and Uranus in quite an eccentric way. It really already brings this sense of like difference with it, the way it moves. And it's a transpersonal planet. It's not a personal planet like some of the others. And what that means is it kind of only becomes into existence in this relationship to Saturn, which is a planet of kind of like making things known, making things real, making things material. And so this has kind of come into our awareness. And then also what that brings, how it interacts with the other bodies in the solar system, what this reveals to us. These are very recent findings. And I'm going to talk more about that later in the show. Then I'm going to talk about this now shamanically. As you may know, a big part of my own life and work is animism, and very specifically shamanism and shamanic healing. Those of you that are familiar with shamanism likely will know there is a very like widely known across the world throughout history notion of shamanic sickness. Now, this really is the wounded healer. And the reason it's the wounded healer is the way the shaman learns to heal, the way the shaman learns to work with and negotiate with the spirits of sickness is because they experienced them first. They were wounded in the same way first. And shamanic sickness, as the name suggests, is not generally an enjoyable experience. It very much is an experience of deep, deep wounding. I've shared on previous shows, and I likely will touch on this again, my own experience of shamanic sickness was decades long and at some points very, very intense. And this was me learning that intimacy with the spirits of sickness. And you could say, well, there is a kind of like sense I've healed them. And yet, have I? If I'm still in intimacy with them, if I'm still in some ways experiencing them, again, it brings about this notion of the wounded healer, that the medicine is in the wound, but it keeps coming from the wound. There isn't this kind of like, okay, it's all done, and now I'm going to move into this completely different life where I just don't have to be in relationship with those spirits of sickness anymore. So again, these are like different lenses, all on this same spirit, this same archetype of the wounded healer. Now, I'm going to just ask this question that's probably on everyone's minds. Why is it even important to know about the wounded healer? Why do we need to know about the wounded healer? Why do we need to honor the wounded healer? Why do we need to embody the wounded healer? And it's a really good question, because I'm not really marketing it, am I? I'm not doing a great job of selling the notion of the wounded healer. And I'm going to share a quote by my beloved Jung on this, who also did much work around this very archetype. Jung said, the doctor, and by doctor we could say healer, medicine man or woman, is effective only when he himself is affected. Only the wounded physician heals. I'm going to read that again without the breakups. The doctor is effective only when he himself is affected. Only the wounded physician heals. So you can hear in that this suggestion of only the wounded healer is a healer. And when I say healer, as you may have heard me talk about before, I don't really necessarily mean any of you that might go by other kinds of work that brings people towards well-being and wholeness, which really is like a deeper definition of healer. You may call yourself some kind of guide or coach or therapist, some kind of practitioner of some kind of transformative or spiritual work. So again, this is very much at an archetypal level we're talking about. But really, if we're in that work of bringing people towards wholeness, bringing people towards individuation with union with our soul, we really are doing the work of healing. But there's no need to call ourselves healers. I only have recently, I may not again in the future. There's personal reasons, partly because of this very work that we're talking about here with the wounded healer, that I'm currently, sometimes will describe myself as a healer. But it's not essential whatsoever. This is not what I'm talking about here. Isn't saying, okay, by becoming aware, becoming intimate with the wounded healer, that means you also then therefore need to be a healer and call yourself a healer. I'm absolutely not saying that. Whatever you currently identify as may well be what you continue to identify as, even as you do the work to become intimate with the wounded healer, which really is the work of you being able to serve as powerfully as you possibly can at the deepest level of your soul. So that's who the wounded healer is for. That's who we're talking about. We're talking about the wounded healer. It's not really necessarily a healer. It could be a healer, but it really is someone who is in that work of serving others and guiding them towards wholeness. And I'm trying to see which way to go next first. Let's come to the wound, actually. Let's come to the wound. So we've talked about who that wounded healer is, and we've talked about kind of why that's even important, and also who you might be. And if we're then going to recognize, okay, you are the wounded healer, or you're being called to become intimate with the wounded healer, of course, part of that is understanding what that wounding is. There was research done at some point in the last 3,000 years, I think it was in the last 20 or so years, by someone called Alison Barr. And she did some what looked like pretty good research on this idea of the wounded healer showing up in, I think it was very specifically, initially, I think it was around kind of psychotherapists and how the wounded healer has shown up for them. And this is an exact line taken from the research. It's the exact causes of the wounds vary enormously. The main categories are abuse, family life as a child, mental ill health, social, family life as an adult, bereavement, mental ill health, others, as in the first version was themselves. This version of mental health is others, as in people in their family, for example. Life-threatening physical ill health related to other people, physical ill health their own, and there's a kind of an other category. But you can see the things I've already mentioned are very, very varied. And I guess most of us are going to have some sense of like, well, yeah, I know the kinds of things that happen to me. And the important distinction here is we likely, unless we've had like a complete dissociation and kind of block something out completely via trauma, most of us do have a sense of like particular experiences and events that we could describe as wounds. And yet, what I absolutely see in both, again, personally, but also the work that we do with people, particularly in medicine, is that it's only through this context of recognizing that the medicine is in the wound, we start to look into the wounds in a very different way. We relate to the wounds in a different way. We relate to them, again, even if we're not using these words, we're relating to the wounds as a wounded healer who ultimately is looking for the medicine to alchemize to serve to others. So that's the first part. It's like there's something distinctly different when we start to look at our wounds in that way. The other thing is that as we start to journey in this very intentional, conscious way, which also has to be in the right circumstances. Again, when we're working in this way with others, there is absolute love and safety. We will go so slowly, so gently, with absolute unconditional love and acceptance, because it is the only way it will be safe enough for people to start to become aware of these deeper layers I'm about to talk about. So again, we can recognize there's this like layer of, oh, this happened to me. It really takes that deep, like womb-like holding to feel safe to start to spiral into what actually is the wound that lies beneath that kind of particular event. And I'm going to share with you, just because, again, I think it's helpful to see the different ways this can show up. Some of the things that I've experienced that absolutely I could describe as wounds of like events and experiences that I would say are wounds. And then I'm going to share like how it's really taken years and years of work to really understand what these were and what they created and where they came from. So I'm not going to like huge amounts of detail. So some of the things I'm going to share are, I guess, quite triggering, but I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail. So at a very young age, I experienced sexual abuse, but it was actually more the backdrop or the kind of what happened as a result of that was probably more traumatizing. And interestingly, was echoed, as often is the case, later on in my 20s. There was a police investigation, a court case. There was a really interesting echoing in something that happened later on. So it was actually not just the abuse, but it was kind of like other things that then rippled out from it. Then when I was 5, my parents separated, and my father, who I was very strongly bonded to, actually left, but left the country as well. And I was absolutely bereft. So it was a real kind of abandonment wound. Then my father returned and I went to live with him. But then I was raised really to a large extent without a mother. Often we weren't living anywhere close, sometimes not even in the same country. And I also had it was a very loving childhood, a very kind of accepting childhood, but huge amounts of change. I think I counted up, and again, mere numbers, I wouldn't take these figures too too seriously. I think I'd lived something like in 21 different places, and I say places because not all of them were houses. 21 places by the time I was 18. So lots and lots of change. And then kind of in my early teens, I started to experience what we could call like psychic phenomena of all different kinds. And you probably have heard me talk about some of these before, which were very scary. And I had no context for them. I had no understanding at that point of shamanism or anything else. I honestly just thought I was at risk of going crazy. I then started to become increasingly aware of my own differences to most people, but certainly most children of my age around me. So, of course, as it's turned out, I was very neurodivergent. I have, many different forms. If we're kind of looking at through a kind of more like modern clinical lens. I'm diagnosed with autism, but I also have ADHD, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, which you can be very familiar with. That's the numbers thing. But back then I didn't know that's why I was so different. I didn't know why I struggled so much in certain kinds of settings, why I'd make mistakes that other people just wouldn't make. So I was starting to become really aware of those differences, but didn't know why. I was also bullied mercilessly during a particular period at school, in way like physically, emotionally, all sorts. I then had a big trauma event happen at 15. And again in my 20s, which again was that mirror of what happened when I was 3. This particular event that happened in my 20s, it was another kind of like abusive attack, but also I almost died. And it rippled into this kind of, police investigation court case, which was, if anything, more traumatizing. As a result of that, I had 15 years of chronic facial pain and panic attacks. I also, I don't know if it's related or not, began to go deaf. And then kind of most recently, that psychic phenomena became very, very disruptive. That was kind of sort of like, if I go through a kind of rough chronological order of things that could be described as like traumatizing experience and events, that's most of them. So the reason I've shared all that is I probably have had a kind of like unusually full life of all these different experiences and events. And, I suspect many of the ones I've spoken about, some of you will have experienced those. And so, of course, I was aware of these, I'm been in this kind of work for a long time. I understood these things that happened to me. What has taken many, many years ongoing and huge amounts of devotion and work is to understand the true spiritual wound that both caused them, really, and this is what I'm going to come to in a moment, caused them, created the conditions for them, but also that came about because of them. And I guess like put in kind of like really basic terms, this is, again, these things are very, very nuanced and deep. But for me, this was a kind of like wound of my own sense of self, a really deep like wounding of like, I don't even know who I am. I have the growing sense I'm very different to most people, and it appears to be very unwelcome, unwanted, and even dangerous. But I don't really have this sense. I've got this deep, deep uncertainty about who I am. And this is kind of both exacerbated, but also kind of, I guess, two sides of the same coin. I'm also extraordinarily open and receptive to all sorts of other things, beings, human, non-human, physical, otherwise. I'm very, very open and receptive. And so these two different things are really the underlying fabric that was needed to be in place in order for many of those wounds to happen. And so I want to come back again to that myth of Chiron, that it was actually his own poison that caused the wound. This is possibly one of the most challenging aspects for us to journey with as we start to make conscious and be in loving relationship to our wounds. In order to be fully sovereign about that, to not feel like a victim to that, there is a part of that kind of recognition that, okay, it's not to say that we're to blame. It's not to say that kind of like as a human, we chose for these things to happen. And yet they are the very stuff of our soul. We came into this lifetime, this body, this soul, with these particular traits, this particular kind of nature, these particular ways that we're open, that set the scene for these events that were fated for us to then have the wound and then ultimately alchemize into medicine. So again, if that at the moment feels just too much, that can be a very confronting thing to hear, this idea of like somehow we're responsible for horrendous things that have happened to us, deeply abusive, damaging, painful, shameful things that happen to us. And my invitation to you is to recognize this absolutely isn't about blaming. It isn't about saying, okay, you chose that, you created it, deal with it. It's to just look at this with, I guess, as much love and as softness, to journey with this in a way that's kind of beyond my ability to even put this into words that make sense to us as humans. This really is the stuff of souls and the sovereignty of souls that only makes sense as we start to get closer and closer to our soul. Okay, so coming back to this question, it's funny actually, I hadn't planned to share quite as much as I have about my own personal journey, but I hope there is something helpful in me doing so. So when we're looking at our core wound, we absolutely can look at it through this lens of what was that experience or event. And that's certainly one of the ways that we work with it in medicine. But again, recognize there is these levels, these layers that we spiral down into when the conditions are right, that will reveal more and more and more, far more beyond the kind of material understanding that we have of like, this happened, therefore this is the wound. There's also something you may have heard me talking about recently, is where Chiron, this planetoid, appears in our charts, can bring an incredible illumination, a very clear illumination of both this cultural archetypal wound, but then also the way that's showing up for us personally. There will be all sorts of aspects of this. You know, it could be ancestral, it could be past lives, it could be that for whatever reason we've come into this lifetime to alchemize and experience a particular species level wound. And again, at an astrological chart level, we can see this in a way that honestly I found quite mind-blowing. I've been in conversations with many medicinal people. When I say medicinal people, people who are in this work, this very work we're talking about, and seeing commonalities in their chart about their Chiron placement that they are like, wow, this is mind-blowing, the accuracy. And so I'm going to share what I would suggest you do is, after this show, if you haven't already got an astrological chart, go run one. I don't have any affiliation with anyone, but the one I quite like is astro.com. If you go to, there's a section on there where you can go to free charts or charts. It's free, but I can't remember if it's called charts or free charts. Ask for an extended chart. And then when you get the results, there will be the kind of mandala of all the astrological chart of yours there. And then like a table below, which is quite helpful to identify the things I'm about to tell you. So I'm going to give you a little kind of like, this is what you can go do afterwards. I'll also write these on the show notes so that you don't have to try and write down everything I'm about to say. So the different, of course, this is a much deeper, longer conversation. Of course, it brings in, like, you know, your whole chart really is also important. But like, again, if we just focus for the moment on this Chiron placement, your Chiron will be in a constellation, in a sign. And so, you know, Gemini, Pisces. And that is something, because Chiron moves slowly. Again, it's got this very eccentric way of moving, but it moves slowly. And it will be in one sign for quite a long time. So you'll notice people of a similar age to you will have the same sign. So that's part of it. And if we recognize the way that an astrological chart works, a good way of holding it is the planet, in this instance, planetoid for Chiron, is like the actor. So we can see it as like a part of us, And those of you that have journeyed with Wake and Wild, we're used to us talking this way, like these kind of notion of like parts of us, like in a child part of us. This is the wounded healer part of us. So Chiron itself is that part of us that is the wounded healer. The sign, the astrological sign, is like its role or its costume. So it's like the actor has now got dressed up into this costume to play a role. And so that role is whatever that particular sign is. So if it's Gemini, it would be a particular role it has that's around kind of mind and speech. So that's what the role is. And then the house is like the stage, is the setting, is like where in life is this action happening. And the houses are numbered 1 to 12. And so whatever house your Chiron is in is the place that this particular wound, which again is expressed through the role, the constellation, and then the house is the place in your life that it would appear. So say, for example, it's in the 7th house. That's the house that is really about kind of union and partnerships and marriage. And so it would be the particular place that this wound is most felt. Then, if you look at any of those aspects, like how it's relating to other planets or your sun, and your sun in particular, this is the thing I keep seeing. Often it's not always the case, and again, it may well be other tricky placements where I don't have time to like really go into, but often I notice people here to be wounded healers often have a particularly painful, and I say painful because it feels painful, aspect relating to their sun. So personally, my Chiron is in direct opposition to my sun, and your sun is really your identity, your sense of self. And so if you have some kind of conjunction with your sun, you can see it's going to have like a very strong effect. There's others too, like for example, ones that relate to Saturn. But in short, they're the three things that if you go look up, and again, I will put these on the show notes, you can go kind of go search for them, do some research in terms of that different aspects of your Chiron placement and see what it reveals about your wounds, and therefore, of course, your medicine once alchemized. And this is something that we're really working with the people that are journeying with the mythical, and will be journeying with this in the next medicine, really starting to look at this at a deeper level. Related to that, of course, this has a kind of astrological link. We often work with human designs and gene keys in the different Waking World Crucibles we run. And again, this is very much taken from the same data that you are your astrological chart pulls from. But it often gives another sort of like different archetypal lens, different languaging. Richard Rudd in particular, the creator and channeler of Gene Keys, has a really beautiful kind of mytho-poetic way of talking about these different archetypes, which again are the planets. They are the planets. So they can be very revealing, particularly as they have this notion of like shadow and gift. So it often talks about it in this way where you can really see, oh, this is the wound and this would be the medicine. And again, particular placements within that really speak to the wounded healer aspect. And then lastly, a kind of more, I guess, is both a kind of general, but it's actually quite a deep inquiry, is to recognize as you're journeying through life, where do you hide and where do you prove? And these are different ways that, like a shadow, that wounding shows up. So hiding is the deflated end of the shadow pole, where you shrink away. You tend to be self-deprecating, humble. You tend to kind of not want to put yourself forward. And that's typically, and often we'll have, it's not to say we won't kind of move across, often we'll have a particular place that we are more comfortable with. Mine personally is the hiding end, the kind of deflated end. The other end, of course, is the proving end, which is the what's known as inflated, which is much more kind of like, look at me, look how amazing I am. But both of them come from the wound. They're both ways of either trying to like kind of like, oh my goodness, I don't want people to look at me, I'm not good enough, the wound is true. And at the other end, it's like, I'm not going to be limited, the wound's not true, I can't bear to be in relationship with it, I can't bear to be seen as that. And so they're both ways of protecting what hurts, protecting that wound, because it is so painful. And so again, this is a kind of general ongoing inquiry where we can start to get like a deeper sense of, this is really at that deeper spiritual level how this wound is showing up, and therefore we can sort of track that back and start to know the source of the wound. And again, all of these are places that we journey deeply into in medicine, because they all, whilst I can talk about them, and even just what you're hearing here is going to be helpful, they really do require like very attentive, loving holding to be able to move through them in a way that feels safe. Okay, I'm going to take a mouthful of tea and then get into why the wound is important in your work. And I'm sure you've already started to hear some of why it's important, but I'm going to talk about some very specific parts. Okay, so why is the wound important in our work? For those of us that, again, whether we call ourselves a healer or not, someone that's in that kind of change work, helping profession, whether that be a coach, a therapist, some kind of spiritual practitioner. Why is this important to know about ourselves? First, what I'll say is, and particularly in some sort of spiritual circles, there can be this kind of like bypassing or denying the importance of the wound. And that's been true for me too. When I first stepped into this work, it was very much from a kind of like ascension spirituality path. Initially, it didn't even have a name. I was just blasted open to spirit upon the death of my father. So it wasn't even like I had a name for it. But it was like I'd been just like everything had changed. I'd been healed of everything at once. And then different parts of my journey, I had kind of like deepening experiences of that. And certainly in those years, and of course, if we have a particular kind of nature that kind of lends itself to being able to dissociate, being able to bypass, being rosy tinted, which I absolutely am, it really helps us to kind of go like, okay, well, there is no wound, there's no healing to do. All we have to see is like, you know, whatever the form of spirituality is, the different ways that, funny enough, I was told about an example of someone saying something today, you know, it's just thought, you know, if I just can see it's just thought, then I don't need to do anything more with it. I don't need to overthink it. Or if I can just know my sort of deeper, whole, unbroken self, nothing else is needed. And of course, there's some like truth to this, but paradoxically, it's both true and untrue, because in order to experience ourselves as this perfect, bright soul, there is work to do first in the healing, in the reclaiming. So again, it's often those of us that are in that work that are even more likely to bypass and deny the wound. The challenge is, by doing so, is not only are we then not doing our own healing work, so we are actually, you know, stunted to a large extent ourselves. It means that even if we are doing, you know, really good work with other people, and I look back and I think, you know, back in the early days before I was really in this work of understanding and healing my own wound, I was doing good work. I was having incredible results often with clients. And yet I know the level of potency of my medicine was just, I can't even find quite the right word to really indicate how different it is now. And this again is partly me having alchemized that particular medicine for my wound, but it's also because my very being is more healed. And so I'm able to be with more, I'm able to love more, I'm able to hold more. So this is why it, again, is so important for those of us that are here to be the healers archetypally. This is why it's so important. I saw this quote. There was a chap, I can't remember the name of the book, and his name I may be mispronouncing. It's something like Henry Nouwen, Nouwen. He wrote a book about the wounded healer. I haven't read it, but I came across this quote. Nobody escapes being wounded. We are all wounded people, whether physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. The main question is not how can we hide our wounds so we don't have to be embarrassed, but how can we put our woundedness in the service of others? When our wounds cease to be the source of shame and become the source of healing, we have become wounded healers. And I love that, because there is, again, this just recognition that this is true for all of us. The choice is whether we actually decide, I'm going to enter that wound. I'm going to be honest about the fact the wound is there. And again, it can be most difficult for those of us that are putting ourselves out there as the people to help others. And again, going back to what I was saying, the shadow pole, this kind of like hiding and proving, this is us when we're being embarrassed about our wound. It's like, I can't bear to be in intimacy with it. I can't bear other people to see it. And therefore we'll be in this like compulsion to keep acting out these same patterns. But when we start to be really honest, like the wounds are there, The wounds are there, and I'm going to devote my life to alchemizing and be a source of healing for others. That's when we've become the wounded healers. Okay, how am I doing for time? As ever, I've got no idea. I think maybe quite a long time. Okay, right, where shall I go now? Oh, I've got another quote for you. This is Marie-Louise von Franz, which is a someone who, amazing woman, and very close to Jung. And the quote goes, "The wounded healer is the archetype of the self." And by that, really, we could say soul. In brackets, it says our wholeness, the God within, and is at the bottom of all genuine healing procedures. The wounded healer is the archetype of the self, our wholeness, the God within, and is at the bottom of all genuine healing procedures. And so it's through this recognition of that wounded healer inside, we're also becoming intimate with our soul. It is at the bottom of all genuine healing procedures. And it means for us, first and foremost, it really is the healing of ourselves, albeit, again, there's this paradox that we stay wounded, which is what I'm about to get into. So, and again, talking about the shaman again, it is the shamanic sickness. It is this relationship with the spirits that makes the shaman. This is, again, this is the hero's journey, the descent into the soul, the place you will meet the divine. It really is like, this is the journey for ourselves first and foremost. There's a Ruby quote that we actually use on the medicine page. I think it might have been the guest on this week's podcast that quoted this, Maggie Whitehouse. So Rumi said, "The wounds are the places where the light enters." And so this means that place that we are most cracked open, most broken, is also the place where we can most be cracked open to love. Both being open to receiving love, and here I'm talking about like the love of the divine, but also to be able to beam it out into the world. It happens simultaneously. And again, I think that's so helpful to recognize that it's only by recognizing ourselves as wounded that this becomes possible. This opening, this vulnerability becomes possible. So lastly, so how do we heal? How do we, and really what I'm talking about here is, how do we alchemize that wound into medicine? Actually, another Jung quote. So I talked about inflation, and Jung warns of the dangers of inflation and projecting this notion of, we're the healed healers and they are the wounded, they being our clients, our patients, our students. The way that we will project that wound onto the patient, and me over here, the healer, is separate. And this is one of the reasons that knowing ourselves as the wounded healer really allows us to be in relationship to reality as it is, not in this kind of like deflated or inflation, this real knowing of like, this wound has to stay present. We have to stay intimate with it in order for it to continue to be medicine. So going back to the Chiron myth, if you remember, he never healed. Chiron couldn't heal. He never healed. What he did do is gave himself over to the divine. And again, that's what really feels, there is a kind of like an acceptance, a deep acceptance of, I am wounded. There's also, again, complete submission to the divine, to the point where he actually gave his life up. And this, I feel, is really, again, the way the wounded healer is showing us the way. This, at an archetypal level, is not literally, obviously, that you're going to give your life up to die, but to give your life over to the divine, to be in deep acceptance of the wound as it is the path, is the North Star. So one way of describing this is, rather than looking at this kind of like idea of like, how can I get rid of this wound? How can I fix this wound? Even how can I cure this wound? There is this like, how can I care for it? How can I bring complete love for it? So one of the examples I gave personally was being neurodivergent. And that's obviously created some very, very challenging experiences over my life. And even now, it can be something that isn't always a breeze. Even today, I had a power cut and I went to a co-working space for the first time in many, many years, maybe even decades. And Jonathan booked it for me, and I said, is it possible to find one that I can take a dog? And the reason I asked that was because I knew that if I could take my dog with me, it would really allow me to like regulate and kind of like have that sense of like this other being with me that would make that transition into a completely different space, which was actually a beautiful space, really friendly. It was actually a lovely experience. I knew having my dog with me would make that something that would be much easier for me to kind of like open and settle into. And so the wound, if we call neurodivergence a wound, and you know, hey, it's not necessarily the right language, but in terms of like, it is an experience my soul came here for, that at times can be deeply painful and deeply shameful. It isn't about curing that. It's about caring for it, becoming intimate with it, becoming familiar with it. And from there, I'm able to bring that to others with the same wound. We can also look at it in terms of, sometimes it's said, we really are, when we're working with other people, we do so from the scar rather than the wound, as in that is the notion of like, there has to be some healing first. There does need to be some healing first. There needs to be this, again, reclamation from shadow, this pulling back of our soul parts. But if we think of it, even when we're talking about a scar, it's not like a scar's invisible. I physically hurt my knee a couple of birthdays ago, really badly. I slipped. I came out of a hot tub, slipped on the wet patio, went down on my knee, and my knee was gushing, literally gushing blood. Long story short, it needed to be stitched up and stuff. It's now got a blooming great birthday souvenir of a scar on my knee, which actually happens to match one that I did when I was a child on the other knee. And it not only has a scar, it actually, you know, it's quite painful still sometimes. Sometimes when it's cold weather, or if I'm going up the stairs and I'm putting weight on it, I can still feel it. So it has healed, and yet it hasn't. It's a scar. I'm still aware of it. I still have vulnerability there. And I think that is a good metaphor for how we relate to our wounds. It isn't kind of like, right, I'm done, I'm all mended, I'm now able to go out and heal those poor buggers who haven't mended yet. There is a real humility, a vulnerability, an intimacy, a deep, deep, real intimacy with the wound that we bring with us. So finally, it is knowing ourselves as the wounded healer, honoring that importance of the wound in our work. As we do that, the more our souls will lead us in the direction of both our own healing, but also empowering the work we do with others. And what I've seen is that just is the gift that keeps on giving. Again, years into this journey myself, where I have alchemized more of my wound into medicine than I really would have ever believed. And yet, again, even now, telling you at the beginning of this podcast, the way the wounded healer has been speaking to me so clearly, this is more work for me to do, more healing, more for me to see. The reason it took me so long to really hear the way the wounded healer was talking to me, it was because I wasn't ready to relate to myself as a wounded healer. It's taken years for me to even recognize myself as a healer. That was if you're seeing me on video, you probably would have seen me do a bit of a grimace. Even now, there was a kind of like, oh, am I really like saying that? There's a kind of some kind of comedy in the fact that I trained for years, deep, challenging, initiatory work to become a shamanic healer, all the while saying, I'm not doing this to become a shamanic healer. I've got zero intention of being a shamanic healer. And yet that's what I began doing. But the funny thing was, even then, it was like somehow separate to me, this whole idea of shamanism and healing. It was like I knew that I was called shamanism. I didn't know I was being called to healing until I finally was ready to know that about myself. Knowing myself as the wounded healer is a whole nother level of healing. To be, again, that humble, that vulnerable, that in relationship to my own pain and shame. That's the work. That's the work, as far as I can see, for all of us. Okay. So I feel like I've journeyed so deep, I'm kind of like having to gather myself to kind of come back up to the surface. So I would say if you're hearing something, I've just said healing, so I'm going to say on my mind instead of hearing. If you're hearing the call of the wounded healer, and I also totally respect if you're like, do you know what? Hell no, I'm not ready for that. There's just so much in what you've said that's triggered the hell out of me. I'm not interested. I honor you. I have been there, and I do not say that in a patronizing way at all. Honor yourself, honor what's right for you. However, if you are feeling that sense of, I know this is for me, even that choice to honor the wounded healer in whatever way is right for you. It could be to put a representation. I've given you several different ways that the wounded healer can be related to. It could be placing a symbol of the wounded healer on your altar. It could be doing what I've suggested in terms of looking at how this shows up for you astrologically. But really recognizing, again, owning, like, I am here to be the wounded healer. In itself is alchemy starting to happen. In itself is you relating to your wounds differently. I would also say, if this really is a path that's calling for you, joining us in medicine, which begins in January, could be the exact right crucible for you to do this work. Again, it's really is what that work is. It's everything we've just been talking about, and far, far more. A lot of the kind of, I guess you could say, sort of more practical material ways of, once we have this sense of our medicine and start to alchemize it, how do we be that in the world? How do we serve that? How do we work through all the other like frustrations and obstacles and, you know, stuff about money and selling, all the things that come up as well. But again, if you're feeling the call to medicine, honor that too. And it's not like you need to know for sure. Right now, Jonathan and I are offering medicine illumination calls. It's with us personally. And this is an opportunity for, first and foremost, for you to be heard and really seen. Jonathan and I have very different gifts in terms of the way that we work with people, the way we see people. Jonathan has, you may have heard me talk about it before, it is like a ridiculously magical gift of being able to see people in a way where he can instantly sometimes see things like different types of neurodivergences, different archetypes. He just knows like that. My seeing's different. I see very much in patterns. I see shadow very clearly. I see where there's lost soul parts. I can see the kind of like, if someone's here, this is what's here for them. This is what's here for them. So we see very differently. But in that call, we will be really looking at you and seeing you at that soul level. And fundamentally, whether you firstly are here to be that wounded healer, to be your medicine, also whether it is, you know, right for you. There is no sense in us that we kind of like want to push people into this journey when it's not right for them or when it's not the right time for them. So even if for example, you are the wounded healer, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right time for you to join us. So that's what that call is for. Very, I keep going to, like, I keep feeling things and thinking, what's the word for that? It's like a very delicate, almost like working with spider web or butterfly wings, which is really almost like the stuff of the soul. It's like really beautiful, delicate strands that we'll be working with, and get to a place where it's clear, is it aligned for you to join us or not? So if you're feeling the call to have one of those conversations with myself or Jonathan, you can firstly go find out more about medicine at wakingthewild.com/medicine. And you'll see on there is a button that says something like book your medicine illumination call. Click that and you can book a call straight into mine or Jonathan's diary. I think it just automatically goes into one or the other, depending on kind of what time or date you choose that works for you. And then we'll speak to you and we will discover if indeed it is aligned for you to join us in January. I think that's everything. Thank you so much for joining me and being part of this. Again, it feels like there's a real honoring, being called forward from the collective to honor the wounded healer. That's what I'm really feeling. There's like a personal call for some of us, but there is something going on deeper right now, where there is like a deeper energetic happening, where this wound and the notion of the wounded healer is very, very present at the moment. And so thank you for being with me as I'm doing my kind of small part in honoring the wounded healer. I honor the wounded healer in you. And I really hope, again, whether you join us or not, that you listen to that call of your soul in whatever way is right for you. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you again next month. Haven't yet got the date, but would love you to join me for the pre-show party for the next All the Everything. And if you already are on our email list for the movie news, I think you can go subscribe at wakingthewild.com/Moonly if you want to be kept up to date with all of that. And for now, I'm sending you all my love. Thank you so much. Mwah. Goodbye.